Welcome to Blending with Algernon. Today we will learn how to make this beautiful looping visual, this thing right here. It's wonderful. It's mesmerizing. Trust me. I am Sir Algernon, 3D instructor extraordinaire, and this is my faithful companion, Freddy. Well, Freddy's actually somewhere behind the curtain, but he's the one that will be controlling the cursor, which will be pressing buttons, pushing the vertices, and so on. So let's get started. Let's crank up Blender. We are working in version 4.3.2. Wonderful. Let's open our default scene, and here we have our camera, light, and cube. That lonely, so underappreciated cube. Go ahead, let's delete it. As you know, we'll be working with geometry nodes. While you don't need to know geometry nodes, that's what this lesson is for. So you should know the basics of Blender. The first thing we'd like to do is create a plane. Geometry nodes is a modifier that needs to be attached to something. We will attach our geometry node to this plane and make all the magic happen. Let's switch over to our geometry nodes layout by pressing the Geometry Nodes tab at the very top. Yes, up there. This layout configuration gives us the necessary panels we will need, including a spreadsheet panel here. This spreadsheet panel gives us a lot of relevant information, none of which I intend to use. So we'll squish it off to the side a little bit. Let's start geo-noding. We do that by pressing the new button right here, and this will give us a group input and output. We may delete the group input, because we will be creating primitives within geometry nodes. Now don't panic. Don't panic. I know our plane has disappeared, but that's just because there's no geometry plugged into the geometry output. We shall fix that in a moment. Since our final animation will be traveling through a tunnel, let's go ahead and create the closest thing we have to a tunnel, which would be a cylinder. When we connect the cylinder node to the group output, we have a primitive in our workspace once again. Within the settings, let's change our segments to 12, make the radius about 2 meters, and we'll make the depth about 50 meters, and really give this a tunnel-like feel. If we switch over to wireframe, we can see what we've got so far. Too many rectangles. That troubles me. Let's fix it by adding a triangulate node. Much better. Triangles are so much more soothing than rectangles. And this gives it, as they say in Hollywood, production value, right, Freddy? All right, let's carry on. Let's move the group output off to the side here so we have a bit more room to work. What we'd like to do now is build a wireframe based off of what we have so far. For that, we will need two very handy nodes. The first one will convert the mesh into a curve, and then the second will convert the curve back into a mesh. You may be asking, why would we want to go from mesh to a curve and back again? But this seemingly silly step will allow us to apply yet another curve to the lines attaching our vertices. Once these two nodes are connected, we will then pull up a curve circle and add that to the profile curve of the curve mesh. And voila, we have a hideous mess. But we can fix it. Let's tighten up the radius, maybe a 0.005. Yes, it looks much more like a wireframe now. Yes, lovely, lovely, lovely. But we've lost the original cylinder. We can fix that too. Let's pull this out and add a join geometry, then the output of that geometry node to the group output. So we have the original geometry. And then our mesh to curve, curve to mesh with a circle curve into the join geometry node. There you go. And now we have both. However, I don't like the ends of our cylinder. If we're going to be tunneling, we need the end of our tunnel to be open, right? So let's go back over here to the original cylinder node and remove the ends. There we go. Nice pipe, tunnel, whatnot. It's coming together fabulously. However, the wireframe is right on top of the outer cylinder. I don't like that. I don't like that one bit. I'd like the wireframe to be inside a bit. So let's add a transform geometry node. Let's put it right there. Very good, Freddy. And let's adjust the X and Y scale just a tad. A 0.95 on X and Y both should do it. And as you can see, our wireframe is inside of our cylinder, exactly where it needs to be. Freddy, we're starting to gather quite a few nodes here. Let's organize. We can box select nodes and with Control, J group them together. F2 allows us to give that group a name, and as you can see, everything will travel together. Lovely. All nice and tidy now. We have our cylinder group, we have our wireframe group. Next we want to add some circular doodads to the wireframe. It will add to the experience, trust me. Now we can't have our circular doodads just placed willy-nilly. We need some order. I'd like to place them where the vertices are intersecting in our wireframe. And for that we will use a new node called Instance on Points. Very powerful. So let's drag that out here, connect it, and create an icosphere node. Connect it to the instance input of the instance on points. And we see nothing. Why? Ha! We must join. Once we do that, we have, yet again, another horrid mess. We shall correct that. Let's bring the radius of our icosphere down. Yes, that looks good. Much, much better. We're getting there. However, our icospheres are connected to the outer wall of the cylinder and not to the wireframe. That might pass mustered in other tutorials, but not here. We need to correct that by grabbing the geometry output of the transform, where we had reduced our wireframe down a touch, and putting that into the instance on points instead. There you go. Perfect. We must keep things tidy. I like it, Freddy. Now it's time to add materials. So let's get a set material node, and since we have three items, the outer wall, the wire, and the icospheres, let's go ahead and create 3 set material nodes and place them accordingly. There we go. But GeoNodes needs to know where the materials are. So let's go over to our Properties panel and add 3 materials. Let's give them adequate names. Cylinder, wire, and icospheres. Well done, Freddy. Under each of the set material nodes, select the appropriate material for that item. Lovely. Now let's switch over to our shader view and work on each of the materials. Freddy, let's start with the icosphere. Icospheres, since it's the easier of the lot. Let's get an emission node and set the color to a bluish teal color and bump up the strength. Oh, before I forget, let's make sure we are in Eevee for rendering. Next, the cylinder material. In our default principled BSDF, let's stick to a nice deep blue. But I'd like a bit more character to that blue, so let's get a color ramp, a noise texture, a texture coordinate node, and finally, a mapping node. Come along, Freddy. Do try and keep up. Start connecting from object, then vector to vector, factor to factor, and color to color. By fiddling with the settings in the noise texture, we get some interesting results. Adjusting the color ramp tightens things up. But wait, Freddy, we've lost our blue. We need to rewire the color ramp to the roughness. Much better. Stop fiddling, Freddy, and let's move on to the wire material. Here, we're going to get a little nutty and mix a couple of shaders. Create an emission shader and a mix shader. Plug the two together. For the emission shader, go with a deep blue, and for the base color, I think something purplish would do rather nicely. As we did in the previous material, let's get the color ramp, noise texture, mapping node, and texture coordinate nodes. Connect away and attach to the factor on the mixed shader. With a little fine-tuning, we're getting some interesting results. All right, Time for a camera to see what we see. Create a camera, and using Control, Alt and 0, let's get the proper view going. Let's center it above our tunnel. If your hands shake like Freddy's, you may wish to use the transform settings for precision. While we are still with our camera, let's adjust a setting. I find it very distracting to see things outside of the camera view, so in the camera settings, open the viewport display sub-settings and passe-partout to 1. Much better. Now, on to some animation. Let's switch up to a side view of everything, and with our camera selected, let's grab it and move it to the entrance to our tunnel. Holding the Control key while dragging will snap us to the edge very nicely. Switching to wireframe view will let us see our camera in the tunnel. If you recall, we made our cylinder 50 meters deep, and since it's centered on the grid, we have 25 meters up and 25 meters down. Our camera should be placed at 25 meters up, the edge of the tunnel. Switching to the timeline, let's increase the frames to 500 and rewind the playhead to the beginning. Now we want an endless loop for our animation. So let's move the playhead into the negative by 1 frame using the left arrow key and keyframe the position of our camera at 25 meters by placing our cursor over the location fields and pressing the letter I. Now move our camera down to the end of our tunnel, which should be a negative 25 meters. Move our playhead to the end of our animation and set the location keyframe. Let's see how that looks. Yes, perfect. That's mesmerizing already. Now for the looping effect. We will need to duplicate our tunnel a couple of times and place them end to end. 2 copies should suffice for now. We can always add more later if need be. Freddy, what are you doing? Oh, I see. Very good idea. We should rotate the tunnel bits as we are moving down. GeoNodes has just the thing. Switch back to Geometry Nodes view. And let's add a transform geometry node. This node will allow for a rotation on the input geometry, in this case the cylinder wall. You'll notice as Freddy slides the Z rotation, the outer tunnel rotates. Marvelous. To animate this rotation, let's do what we did with our camera. Back to the timeline, rewind and back 1 more. And keyframe the rotation parameters in the transform geometry node. Forward to the end. Change the Z value to 360 and keyframe it. Everything is moving wonderfully. Now for rotation of the inner bits. I'd like to rotate these in the opposite direction. We will need a separate transform geometry node for that. However, we do want the wireframe and the ichiospheres to move together, so both should go into the same transform geometry node. We will need another join geometry node to achieve this. Now set the keyframes, as before, but this time from negative 360 to 0. Perfect. Now on to our lighting. Let's select the world panel and set the background color to black. Now let's add a new area light and move it to our camera. Change the color to one of our blues and increase the power to around 500 watts. This is looking beautiful. Let's change the light from a square to a disc And let's also move it to right behind our camera. Now parent the light to the camera so that it will move along with the camera. Let's add a second light. This time a point light. Let's move it closer to the camera. Make it a nice red color and increase the power. This is looking spectacular. Let's move the light further along the tunnel, and let's also change the power of the light over our animation. At the start, set the power to 0, midway to around 200 watts, and finally at the end back to 0. I think we need another copy of our tunnel at the very end, don't you think so, Freddy? Yes, this will help the looping illusion. All right, now for the finishing touches. Let's send this spreadsheet to the accountant and get a compositor window. Click Use Nodes and let's add a glare node. Switch it to bloom and let's see what we've got. To see the effect in our 3D view, we'll need to set the compositor to always in the viewport shading drop-down. Why? I couldn't say. Looking good. Let's bump this animation up to an 11. Back in the compositor window, add a second glare node and set it to ghosts. Beautiful. Let's add a second point light for good measure. Place it a bit further along in the tunnel and change up the color. Ah, entrancing. Reminds me of my days with Timothy Leary. All right, Freddy, let's wrap this up. Output the animation in the format of your choice, and Bob's your uncle. We're done. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Please consider subscribing and liking it. If you don't, Freddy will come to your house and personally explain to you the merits of subscribing and liking. Just kidding. Until next time, I am Sir Algernon, and this is Blending with Algernon. I thought that went very well, for our first tutorial and all. Don't you think, Freddy? But we should definitely come up with a theme song of some sort, you know, to give it a little pizzazz. Okay, cue the logo and let's get something to eat. I'm famished.